The title of my talk is An Inquiry into the Value of Work. But this is really going to be quite a bit broader than that might suggest. This grows out of a reflection that for me started about 20 years ago, when I started noticing changes in material culture that seemed to be making it harder to be self-reliant. There's a design philosophy that's emerged where the point seems to be to hide the works. So for example, if you lift the hood on some cars now, what you'll see is something like this. Essentially, there's another hood under the hood, as though the sight of an alternator might offend us somehow. A lot of high-end cars now don't even have a dipstick, so you couldn't check your own oil level if you wanted to. Instead, I guess you're sent an email from someplace if your oil level gets low. So I can't be the only person who's a little bit creeped out by this. Now, it used to be that in addition to a dipstick, you had something called an idiot light. And it was called an idiot light for a reason, right? We had a low regard for anyone who was so uninvolved in their own car that they let it get to the point that the light is coming on. But there's some weird cultural logic whereby idiocy, that is a lack of involvement, gets recast as something desirable, right? It's a sign of technological progress. And of course, it is a kind of progress when you no longer have to mess around with dipsticks and dirty rags and all that. But I also just want to notice that there is a kind of moral education that is tacit in technology, and it can go in various directions. The way things are going currently, it often feels like the modern personality is getting reformed in the direction of passivity and dependence. There are fewer occasions to be directly responsible for your own physical environment. And with that, I think, comes less expectation of responsibility. If you're over a certain age, and I'm pretty sure some of you are, you may remember that the Sears catalog used to include these blown up parts diagrams for all the appliances they sold. And by the way, raise your hand if you know what this is. Okay. I've shown this picture to some college-age audiences and just gotten a look of complete befuddlement. So yes, a sewing machine. So it was just taken for granted that the consumer would want this kind of information. Whereas now, let's say your washing machine goes on the fritz. Well, even if you are the kind of person who's comfortable with motors and solenoids and relays, you might well feel daunted from taking on the repair yourself just because of the layers of electronic crap, frankly, that get piled on top of machines gratuitously very often. And besides, time is money, right? You can't learn to do everything, so it often makes more sense from a narrow economic perspective to just get a new washing machine and send the new one off to a landfill, even though you know it's probably just some $15 part that went bad. Now, you can criticize that decision from the perspective of environmentalism and sustainability, and I think that's an important argument to make. But the argument I want to make is different. It's really about the effects on the individual. Because I think that kind of learned helplessness leaves us bereft of something that's really at the core of being human, and that is individual agency. And by that, I simply mean the experience of seeing a direct effect of your actions in the world and knowing that these actions are genuinely your own. And I want to highlight this idea because I think it's sort of a hallmark of modern life, that we often feel like we're moving in these channels that have been projected from afar by sort of vast impersonal forces that are very difficult to understand. Some of us worry that we're actually becoming stupider. and begin to wonder if getting an adequate grasp on the world intellectually may actually depend on getting a handle on it in some literal and active sense. I think that's why shop class in schools is important. That's why tinkering is important. These are ways that a young person begins to make his or her world intelligible. And by contrast, if you don't feel that you can have an effect on the world, well, then it becomes quite attractive, I think, to check out of it and go into a virtual world where you're offered a kind of fantasy of agency and competence, right? So in playing a video game, you blow stuff up and you get blown up and you just hit reset, and there are no real consequences to your actions. Unlike, say, wiring a house, where if you get it wrong enough, the house will in fact burn down. So I like to talk about work as it appears on TV, because that's kind of an easy way into the zeitgeist or something. So there's a number of shows like Deadliest Catch, Ice Road Truckers. Has anyone seen these shows? They're hugely popular, apparently, and there's a whole bunch of them. So Deadliest Catch depicts these commercial fishermen in the Bering Sea. And the deck is covered in ice. Sometimes it's like 20-foot seas. That basket is full of fish on a good day. Maybe it weighs 1,000 pounds. It's swinging around. It's sort of crazily dangerous work. And people die all the time doing it. There's another show called Dirty Jobs that shows all kinds of grueling work. There was one episode that showed a guy who inseminates turkeys for a living. I think the weird fascination of these shows must lie in the fact that they're showing these confrontations with material reality that have become exotically unfamiliar to us. Many of us do work that feels more surreal than real. So working in an office, it's often difficult to see any tangible results from your actions. What exactly have you accomplished at the end of any given day? Where the chain of cause and effect is opaque and responsibility tends to get spread around, that experience of individual agency can be a little bit elusive. There's actually some great sociological literature on middle managers. And the picture that emerges is that they tend to feel quite insecure in their jobs. Now, say you're a carpenter and you have a problem with your boss. You can say to him, it's plumb, it's level, and it's square. Go check it yourself. But when you don't have appeal to concrete objective standards like that, you're never quite sure where you stand. There's a lot of kind of walking on eggshells and discrete suggestions. And as it turns out, what middle managers have to do a lot of is managing what others think of them. The office can be a fairly paranoid place as compared to the job site. Now, you could point to a number of different pop culture items that are, I think, getting at this. There's Dilbert. There's a fantastic movie called Office Space that's really funny, and I recommend it. So it seems like we have these portrayals of cubicle life that attest to a kind of dark absurdism with which many Americans have come to view their white-collar jobs. So the question is there a more real alternative? I mean, short of inseminating turkeys or moving to Alaska. And I think there is. So I want to speak up for the skilled manual trades and suggest that that can be a life that's worth choosing. Now you might say, why does that even need to be said? Well, I think it does need to be said because we've developed an educational monoculture in this country where just about every kid feels pressure to go to college and get on a certain track where you end up working in a cubicle. High school shop class programs were widely dismantled in the 90s to make room for computer classes. I think we had this idea then that somehow we're going to be gliding around in a pure information economy. But the truth is that some people, including some who are plenty smart, would rather be learning to build things or fix things. And why not honor that? Now, sometimes we do praise people who do work that is straightforwardly useful. But often the praise betrays an assumption that they had no other options. We might idealize them as the salt of the earth and emphasize the sacrifice for others that their work might entail. And of course, that kind of sacrifice is real. So consider the hazards faced by a lineman restoring power during a storm, for example. But what if such work answers as well to a basic human need of the one who does it? I take that to be the suggestion of this very nice poem by Marge Piercy, which concludes with these lines: "The pitcher longs for water to carry, and a person for work that is real." I think, I can't see it. So what I want to suggest is that maybe beneath our gratitude to the lineman is something different, something more like envy. Here's somebody doing something serious, something that is possible to take seriously. And how many of us can say that? So given more time, I would, this is an outline of the longer version of this. I'm going to skip the economic argument for the trades. We have two economists in the house, and they probably want to weigh in on this. And I look forward to that. So let me just tell you a little of my own story. So I graduated from UC Santa Barbara in 1989 and with a degree in physics. And I moved down to LA to look for work in the aerospace industry. And this was a bad time to be doing that because they were all laying off. The defense budget was being cut, et cetera. So after about 4 or 5 months, my savings were all gone. And I found myself going around the parking lot of a home improvement store, putting flyers on the windshields of cars to advertise my services as an electrician. This is work that I'd started doing when I was 14 as an electrician's helper and did it all through college in the summers. So the flyers said, "Unlicensed but careful." And it generated immediate response. I mean, I'd been for 5 or 6 months trying to get work with my physics degree to no avail. So I went into business doing that for a while, illegally. And I was very glad to have something to fall back on. In doing that work, I never stopped taking pleasure in this moment that would come at the end of a job when I would flip the switch and the lights would come on. In fact, I had this thing I would say, "and there was light." And I never got tired of saying that. So it was an experience of agency and competence. The effects of my work were visible for all to see, just literally visible. So my competence was real for others as well. It had a social currency to it. It wasn't something just in my own head. I was sometimes quieted at the sight of a gang of conduit entering a big panel in a commercial setting like this. Bent into nestled, flowing curves with varying offsets that somehow all terminate in the same plane. And I can't quite see it from my vantage, but in the upper right-hand corner, look at the bends that come around and down and up and over. This was a skill that was so far beyond my abilities that I felt like I was in the presence of some genius. And the man who bent that conduit surely imagined this moment of recognition as he worked. And by the way, the name of the guy who bent this conduit is Denny Kaye. And there he is with his pipe bender. As a residential and light commercial electrician, most of my work got covered up inside of walls. But still, I felt pride in meeting what are really the aesthetic demands of a workmanlike installation. Maybe, at some point another electrician would come along and open up the wall and see what I'd done. I didn't want to be embarrassed at the thought of that. I felt responsible to my better self, or rather to the thing itself. It's been said that craftsmanship consists simply in the desire to do something well for its own sake. If the primary satisfaction is intrinsic and private in that way, there's nonetheless a kind of self-disclosing that takes place. There's a philosopher named Alexandre Kojève who said, "You recognize your own product in a world that's actually been transformed by your work. You recognize yourself in it. You discover and also reveal to others an objective reality that was at first only subjective in your own head." The satisfactions of manifesting oneself concretely in the world through manual competence have been known to make a person quiet and easy. They seem to relieve him of the felt need to offer chattering interpretations of himself to vindicate his worth. He can simply point. The building stands. The car now runs. The lights are on. He has no need for a sign like this one. The well-founded pride of the tradesperson is far from the gratuitous self-esteem that educators would impart to students as though by magic. It's also far from the anxiousness of Dwight. If you're an electrician, either you can bend conduit or you can't, and the fact is plain for all to see. You have some solid ground to stand on in your self-assessment, and it's the same ground on which others will assess you. Some people get hustled off to college and then to the cubicle against their own inclinations and natural bents when they'd rather be learning to build things or fix things. There's a woodshop teacher named Doug Stowe who also writes beautifully about his work as a shop teacher. And he said, "In schools, we create artificial learning environments for our children that they know to be contrived and undeserving of their full attention and engagement. Without the opportunity to learn through the hands, the world remains abstract and distant, and the passions for learning will not be engaged." I don't think that's true of every student, but it's true of enough students that we ought to worry about it. A gifted young person who chooses, let's say, to become a mechanic rather than accumulate academic credentials is viewed as eccentric, maybe even self-destructive. There's a pervasive anxiety among parents that there's only one track to success for their kids, and it runs through a series of gates controlled by prestigious institutions. And of course, there's also a wide use of psychiatric drugs to medicate boys in particular against their natural bent toward action. The better to keep things on track, as the school nurse says. I'm picturing Nurse Ratched. And of course, this serves the interests of educators in preserving their own sanity. And I know that because I taught high school for a year. It was a complete disaster. And I would have loved to have had a Ritalin fogger in my classroom just to maintain order. So I get the problem, and I'm sympathetic. But I think what the problem really is that it's a rare person, male or female, who's naturally inclined to sit still for 16 years in school and then indefinitely at work. Now, interestingly, things are quite different in Germany. At least they were when I last researched this while writing the book. There, a smart and ambitious 16-year-old might imagine himself becoming, let's say, a prototype machinist at Mercedes-Benz. And that's a respectable ambition to have. And in fact, when I looked into this, it was, I think, about 60% of 16-year-olds entered an apprenticeship program. They just have, or at least had recently, a very different culture of work and education. In the US, apprenticeship is often criticized for being too narrow in education. It's almost as if we think students shouldn't be burdened with any particular set of skills, but just being there's a kind of general, critical reasoning skills or something. But I think it bears thinking about that when you go deep into some particular practice, it trains your skills of perception and concentration. You become more discerning about these particular objects, whatever they may be. So what I want to suggest is that technical education, though it's certainly narrow in its immediate application, can be understood as part of education in the broadest sense, that is, intellectual and moral formation. The trades suffer from low prestige, and I think this is based on a simple mistake. Because the work is dirty, many people assume it's also stupid. We've developed a dichotomy of knowledge work versus manual work, as though these are two very different things. But that's a distinction that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Say you're trying to diagnose why a car doesn't idle properly. It's not a trivial problem. And more generally, I think the kind of thinking that goes on in the skilled trades can be genuinely impressive, but only if we stop to notice it. Conversely, I think we sometimes romanticize white-collar work by presuming it has more intellectual content than it may turn out to actually have. There's such a thing as the white-collar sweatshop. A lot of it gets dumbed down and can be every bit as stultifying as the assembly line. Now, by contrast, what a plumber does, or an electrician, or an auto mechanic, is fundamentally different from the assembly line. It can never be reduced to simply following a set of procedures. The physical circumstances in which you do these jobs vary too much for it to be reduced to following a script. It always requires improvisation and adaptability. And so you feel like a human being rather than a cog in a machine. Now, obviously, there's a great diversity of different kinds of work that takes place in an office, and some of it is much better than others. I've had some of the lousier white-collar jobs, and I'm sure that colors my perception of these things. So really, I think more important than the question of whether you work with your hands or work in an office is the question of whether the job entails using your own judgment or not. But it's on precisely those grounds that I think the trades are worth taking a fresh look at. They're not for everybody, but they can be a good life for someone who wants to use his or her mind at work. And I count myself in that category, so let me say a little bit about the intellectual challenges of the work that I was doing when I wrote Shop Class and then the years preceding that. So I had this, that's the cover of the book, but it's also, that was one of the buildings of my shop in the latter years. So I worked on Japanese and European bikes mostly. These were tended to be older bikes with some vintage cachet that made people willing to spend money on them. So my decision to go into that line of work was a choice that seemed to perplex some people. My previous job was as director of a think tank in Washington. And when I quit that job and went into business fixing bikes, it made for some awkward moments at cocktail parties. Someone would ask, "What do you do?" And I'd say, "I fix motorcycles." There'd usually be a sort of silence that followed. And I think what made it awkward is that in saying that, I would be feeling pride, and the other person would be feeling sort of embarrassed on my behalf, sort of sorry they asked. So these two just didn't match up at all. So let me see if I can explain the appeal. In fixing motorcycles, you come up with several imagined trains of cause and effect to account for manifest symptoms, and you try to judge their likelihood before tearing anything down. This imagining relies on a mental library that you develop. An internal combustion engine can work in a number of different ways, and different manufacturers have tried different approaches. Each has its own ways of going bad and failing. Here's basically a pile of shrapnel in the bottom of the crankcase. This is a Ducati bevel drive motor from the early 70s. There's the same motor put back together, looking nice. You also develop a library of sounds and smells and feels. For example, the backfire that's caused by an air-fuel mixture that is too lean is subtly different from a backfire that's caused by an ignition problem, timing being off. As in any learned profession, you just have to know a lot. So if the motorcycle is 40 years old, like this, from an obscure maker that went out of business 20 years ago, its proclivities are mostly known through a kind of lore. I think it'd be impossible to do such work in isolation without access to a collective historical memory. You have to be embedded in what's really a community of mechanic antiquarians. And these are relationships that are maintained by telephone, I find, even in the internet era, in a sort of reciprocal network of favors that spans the country. And when I was doing this work, my most reliable source was a guy named Fred Cousins right here in Chicago on Goose Island. He had such an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure European motorcycles that all I could really offer him in exchange was deliveries of obscure European beer. But it worked for a while, at least. Some diagnostic situations contain a lot of variables. Any given symptom may have several possible causes, and further, these causes will interact with one another and be difficult to isolate. In deciding how to proceed, there often comes a point where you have to step back and get a larger gestalt. Have a cigarette, walk around the lift. The gap between theory and practice kind of stretches out in front of you, and this is where it starts to get interesting. What you need at such moments is a kind of judgment that really arises only from experience. It's hunches rather than rules. So for me, at least, there was more real thinking going on in the bike shop than there was in the think tank. That job required me to very often reason backwards from some desired conclusion to some suitable set of premises. It was a policy place, and like any such place, it had taken certain positions, which meant that there was some fact that we were more fond of than other facts. As its figurehead, I found myself making arguments that I didn't fully buy myself, and this was demoralizing. Further, my boss seemed intent on retraining me according to a certain cognitive style, I'll call it. It was that of the corporate world that he had recently come from. This style demanded that I project an image of rationality. That was very important. But not indulge too much in actual reasoning, because it could sort of lead off in the wrong direction if you're not careful. By contrast, in fixing bikes, you answer to standards that aren't open to manipulation in that way. Either the bike starts and runs right, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, there's no weaseling your way out of the fact. And I like that about it. The work is often frustrating, but it's never irrational. You might say the BS quotient is low. Unless you're dealing with Harley owners, and it's actually quite high. I would just, you need a different kind of expert, maybe a psychiatrist or something, with it. Because it's all about the costume, right? The chaps, and they're like, I'm not sure what's going on there. Mechanical work required me to cultivate certain intellectual habits. And habits of mind have an ethical dimension we don't often think about. Good diagnosis requires attentiveness to the machine, almost a conversation with it, rather than assertiveness, as in a position paper produced on the K Street think tank. The cognitive psychologists speak of metacognition, which is the activity of stepping back and thinking about your own thinking. Is what you do when you stop for a moment in your pursuit of a solution and wonder whether your understanding of the problem is adequate. So, for example, the slap of worn-out pistons hitting their cylinders can sometimes sound quite a bit like loose valve tappets. So to be a good mechanic, you have to be constantly open to the possibility that you may be mistaken. This is a virtue that is at once cognitive and moral. It seems to develop because the mechanic, if he is the sort who goes on to become good at it, internalizes the well-working of the motorcycle as an object of passionate concern. I don't know how else you can explain the elation he gets when he identifies the root cause of some problem. There were times in my shop when I would run over and kick a garbage can just out of kind of exuberance at having finally cracked some hard diagnostic nut. This active concern for the motorcycle is reinforced by the social aspects of the job, what I'm calling social embeddedness. Like many independent mechanics, my business was based entirely on word of mouth. I sometimes bartered services with machinists and metal fabricators, and that has a very different feel than transactions with money. It really puts you in a community. The result is that I really didn't want to screw up anyone's bike or charge more than a fair price. You often hear people complain about mechanics and other tradespeople whom they take to be dishonest or incompetent, and certainly that happens. But it's also true that the mechanic deals with a large element of chance that might be hard to appreciate if you haven't done this kind of work. I once accidentally dropped the feeler gauge down into the crankcase of a brand new Kawasaki Ninja, almost brand new. It was doing its first scheduled valve adjustment. So this is disastrous. And on this occasion, I escaped having to do a complete tear down on this motor only through an operation that involved the use of a stethoscope, another pair of trusted hands, and the sort of concentration we associate with a bomb squad. When I finally laid my fingers on that feeler gauge, I felt like I had cheated death. I don't remember ever feeling so alive as in the hours that followed. Often as not, however, such crises do not end nicely like that one did. Moments of elation are counterbalanced with failures, and these two are vivid. Take place right in front of your eyes. One time my shopmate forgot to tighten the front axle on a bike, and the guy got several blocks away and came back complaining of a shaking in the front end. So you can get hurt. Someone else can get hurt. It's serious stuff. With stakes that are often high and immediate, the manual trades elicit heedful absorption in one's work. They're punctuated by moments of pleasure that take place against a darker backdrop, which is a keen awareness of catastrophe as an always present possibility. The core experience is one of individual responsibility, often cashed out in face-to-face interactions between a tradesperson and his customer. So by way of concluding, I would say a good job is one where you can put your full capacities to work and see an effect in the world. And academic credentials don't always guarantee that. And in fact, I'd say that educators who want to steer students, steer young people toward work that has the kind of cognitive and social richness that I've tried to describe can do that in part by rehabilitating the manual trades based on a firmer grasp of what such work is really like. Now, to do that would take courage. Any high school principal who doesn't at least claim as his goal, 100% college attendance, is likely to be accused of harboring low expectations and run out of town by indignant parents. This indignation is hard to stand against, since it carries all the moral weight of egalitarianism. Yet it's also snobbish, insofar as it regards the trades as a low expectation. The thought I want to leave you with is that maybe the best sort of democratic education is neither snobbish nor egalitarian. Rather, it would give a place of honor in our common life to whatever is best. And at this weird moment of growing passivity and dependence, why don't we publicly recognize what's really a kind of yeoman aristocracy among us? I mean those who gain real knowledge of real things, the kind that we all depend on every day. Thank you.
Speaking of face-to-face encounters, we'll have two of them now. First, Kirk Doran, and then Elisa Rubbo.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. I'm Kirk Doran. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm just honored to be able to discuss for a few minutes Matthew's really excellent talk. So I specialize in labor economics, studying labor markets, innovation economics, studying how people generate new knowledge and share it with each other, and I also do work on Catholic social teaching. So this is my discussion. So let me start with some things that I absolutely love about our speaker's talk. So Matthew's journey was motivated by an important distaste for unreality. He shared, I was making arguments I didn't fully buy myself, and this was demoralizing. He said he was trained in a certain cognitive style, which demanded that he projected an image of rationality, but not indulge too much in actual reasoning because it could lead off in the wrong direction. Elsewhere, he's written, the trappings of scholarship were used to put a scientific cover on positions arrived at otherwise. These positions served various interests, ideological or material. So one way of summarizing his kind of happy story is it's a journey of pursuing reality. Everything that Matthew enjoys about the better life he eventually built, including the deeper soulcraft of that better life, is related to a deeper connection to reality than he had in such jobs as the think tank. Let's take one example that's important. Individual agency, the experience of seeing a direct effect of your actions in the world and knowing that these actions are genuinely your own. In Matthew's case, this experience of individual agency was helped by the reality of physical things, whereas it had been hindered by the unreality of the think tank. Likewise, all of the goods that Matthew has been talking about have been related to what he described as social embeddedness, community aspects. His experience of individual agency as instantiated in those social interactions was helped by the reality of interacting with people in the context of objective physical things, whereas it had been hindered by the performative, paranoid, insecure interactions about subjective things. So my question is, what in the world does the best job of getting us in touch with reality and building relationships based on reality? If being in touch with reality and building relationships based on reality are what have given Matthew the happier and more flourishing life that he has now, what in the world does the best job of giving us those things? Is it getting in touch with physical things, or is it something broader? So I'm going to propose it's something broader, and I think that's consonant with Matthew's own beliefs. But to make a case for that, I only have 5 minutes, so bear with me. Ultimately, even when we're interacting with physical objects, when we love reality in that interaction, what we are doing when we love reality, the action we are doing is loving reality with our minds. So it's how working with motorcycles and motorcycle customers and fellow motorcycle experts makes Matthew think differently than he thought before that really moves him. So in the Catholic world, we would say something more fundamental. When we love God with our minds. And what Catholic tradition tells us about loving God with our minds is that this happens more deeply and more fruitfully and more successfully when we cultivate the virtues including necessarily what are classically known as the intellectual virtues of understanding, knowledge, and wisdom. And it turns out that Catholic tradition has a lot to say about how to cultivate those virtues. So what does the Catholic intellectual tradition tell us about the relationship between contact with reality and soulcraft? More broadly, what can philosophers such as Aristotle tell us about the relationship between contact with reality and growth in virtue in general? Even more broadly, or perhaps more oddly, what can social scientists such as applied microeconomists tell us about the relationship between contact with reality and the potential to even possibly experience human achievement? It actually turns out that all three of these things say roughly the same thing. So here's my case. What leads to virtue, human flourishing, and human achievement is being a part of societies that are full of interactions which look like the following. People freely share their knowledge with each other. They do so truthfully because they truly desire what is best for the other person, true friendship. They love the knowledge for its own sake. They love each other for their own sakes, and together they pursue what's known as a common good. So in Catholic social thought, societies that satisfy those above conditions have moral weight. They're necessary for the continuation of the polis and the church, and are to be supported in social justice. More broadly, philosophers such as Simone Weil and others have pointed out that loving knowledge for its own sake and the kind of loving attentiveness that that entails, even knowledge of abstract universals like mathematics, is precisely the kind of loving attentiveness that makes us more capable of being attentive to the needs of others and loving others for their own sake. So actually the two components of such societies mutually support each other, or in the language of economics, they might be in equilibrium. From the economic side, we can actually prove, using results from Nobel laureate Paul Romer and others, that something like the above is literally a necessary condition for even the possibility of any long-term per capita economic growth. So the question becomes, how can we pursue this broader goal in all its diverse instantiations? It's a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is how to prepare people for lives built around building such friendships and societies, and how to support them as they build them. But one way of misinterpreting Matthew would be comparing a disordered contemplative philosophical intellectual life, the think tank, with an ordered material life, vintage motorcycle repair. And Matthew did a great job of stepping beyond that. But one might mischaracterize what our speaker was saying as basically an apples to oranges comparison, which could make it seem like the challenges and opportunities are better for using the material life, shop class, to further our connection with reality than using, say, the liberal arts. But the tradition is universal in ascribing that highest flourishing to the contemplative, philosophical, intellectual life. And we know, moreover, that intellectual goods such as knowledge can at least possibly be shared with everyone without diminishing. My daughter, when she's using the Pythagorean theorem, and my son needs to use it, he doesn't say, "Dad, Teresa's using the Pythagorean theorem and got to get her to stop using it so I can use it." They can both use it at the same time. The more interesting material goods, like a specific, unique, vintage motorcycle, it cannot be shared endlessly without diminishment. So I think both the opportunities and the challenges are actually better for pursuing making the contemplative, philosophical, intellectual life more widely available. So I'm looking forward to talking in a discussion about all of that, and I just want to thank again Matthew for his great talk. So thank you, Matthew.
So now we'll have a chance for Elisa to talk, and then Matt will have his time.
All right, thank you very much for inviting me to comment on this great book. It's been a pleasure to read it. It's been a very thought-provoking book. And in my remarks, I think I'll take more of the square economist perspective. So just to give a one-line summary of the starting point, Matthew in his book points out how the way our workplace and our consumer experience and our education is organized creates some obstacle to our fully developing our human experience. And in particular, he points out that by removing the opportunity for judgment calls on the workplace or in the education system, we are basically discouraging people from engaging more fully with reality and taking responsibility for it. So Matthew kind of, I would say most of the examples that he puts in his book and examples that he offered in his talk are very vivid, and I think they are fundamentally concerned with the evolution of our production process. As an economist, that really strikes me as being all about the way our production is organized and our workplace is organized. And so then this kind of raises the question, why did we end up there? What are the forces that shape the evolution of our technology? Is this the product of the decision of just a few powerful individuals, or is this the product of some obscure market forces, or is there something we can do about it, and what's the cost of changing the way our production and consumption are organized? So to how we got there, I would kind of borrow a bit from where Matthew takes it in the book, and I think he kind of traces back, at least as a fundamental stage of the change of our production process, the times of Henry Ford, where production lines first became a thing. And it really strikes me that Henry Ford would not have come up with the production line had he not had a big market that he could sell his cars to. So I think kind of the expansion in market size that happened around those times is an essential element. Just to give a concrete other concrete examples, you could think of chains like Starbucks and McDonald's. Those are also fairly standardized production line style services. Would they exist if those chains were not able to ship merchandise and ingredients all across the country easily? So this market size is really an essential ingredient, and you can think that any entrepreneur that has some good business idea and some capital to invest is for sure very tempted to take advantage of this big market. And it seems to me that standardization of the production process and also centralization of the design of production, these would seem pretty natural corollaries of an entrepreneur wanting to take advantage of the market size. And in addition, standardizing the production process and kind of centralizing the knowledge of it has the additional perk that it kind of makes workers more replaceable, and so it lowers their bargaining power. So it seems to me that this kind of trends in the organization of production serve well the interests of entrepreneurs. But on the other hand, Ford could sell his car because they were cheaper. So to some extent, actually, this organization of production goes somehow towards the interests of consumers as well. So is there really a trade-off between us having cheap Ford cars and being able to afford a lot of consumption goods and somehow preserving a production process that respects the dignity of our labor? So as economists, we don't have great answers to this question, but I would say economists are working to get towards a fuller understanding of what determines the direction of technological innovation. And in particular, there are a few observations that make me somewhat optimistic that there is not such a stark trade-off between preserving the dignity of work and at the same time fostering an increase in productivity and overall life standards. And one topic that is hotly debated these days is contraposing new technologies that are aimed at replacing labor versus new technologies that instead are aimed at complementing labor. And this is particularly stark in the case of artificial intelligence. Generative AI is often intended as replacing the need for human thinking, whereas some people are advocating for other types of AI that instead are complementary to human thinking. And some prominent economists, for example, Doran, have been pushing the idea that human complementing technologies historically have proven to increase productivity more in the long run. Another consideration that kind of makes me optimistic is that I think technology development and technology adoption are very much a process. And by using a technology, we more and more discover what its merits are, but also what its shortcomings are. And this process can take a long time. It could be of the order of decades or centuries before we actually manage to understand how important some side effects are. So for example, again, kind of remaining close to the production line example and this centralization of knowledge in the production process, we might find that production line is good at making a lot of cars for cheap, so we like it in the short run. But then we might also realize that by centralizing knowledge, there's only few people who have enough expertise to be able to produce new ideas and to generate an innovation. So we might over time realize that actually what seemed good in the short run is not as good from a longer run perspective. So in a sense, we might think that, just give it some time, somehow the market is going to fix itself. And we are going to somehow be able to offset or adapt and offset to some of the side effects of the new technologies that we created. But on the other hand, I would say the market fixes itself is a bit of an abstract notion. The market is not just this impersonal thing. Of course, the market is bigger than each of us, but we all participate in the market, and we all somehow influence the market with our choices. And so it is particularly important that we as consumers of products and users of technologies apply some critical judgment and always measure the products and the technologies against our values. And I think Matthew's book is particularly important in that it really brings to our attention such fundamental value, which is that technologies should not be aimed at replacing the need for human judgment and human engagement with reality, but rather to open up new possibilities for judgment and engagement to take place. So yeah, thank you. I hope to conclude it on a hopeful note, and thank you very much to Matthew for giving us the opportunity to engage with this thought, and to Lumen Christi for organizing the event.
I think what we'll do now is, Matt, if you'd like, we can give you 5 minutes or so to respond to both of these comments, and then we'll take a single audience question.
Sorry if I went on too long and made us short on time. Thank you for the two very rich sets of comments. I think I'll start with Elisa's. There was a lot in there. I'm just going to pick out something. So, this kind of this trade-off you mentioned between standard of living, which tends to be supported by mass production, versus something more artisanal, let's say. I would want to enlarge the idea of sort of standard of living, of well-being, to include not just the consumption side, but the qualitative character of work. So when Henry Ford started the production, the assembly line, so you have to understand that before that, there were hundreds of auto manufacturers. In Illinois alone, there were dozens. So these were little shops, and they would recruit mechanics from bicycle shops and carriage shops, like horse carriage shops. So these were all around sort of tradespeople, craftsmen. The great innovation of the assembly line was to separate thinking from doing. So now, essentially, what Ford did is gather up all that craft knowledge scattered in the minds of these guys and instantiate it in a process. And once you've done that, you no longer need skilled craftspeople. You just need people to stand there and pull a lever over and over. So in the early days of this innovation, in order to add 100 workers to the line, he would have to hire 900 such was the attrition rate. People hated this. Eventually, people got used to it. So there's this was sort of the moment of the degradation of work. And if you've probably heard of Taylorism, this is sort of scientific management. And this basic logic of separating thinking from doing then got extended into basically every corner of the capitalist economy, including white-collar work, where a lot of skilled professionals basically get reduced to clerks. And the cognitively rich part of the work gets concentrated in an ever smaller elite. I think I can connect that to Kirk's remarks. The thing that really jumped out at me was when you mentioned love. So a friend of Mark and I's named Adrian Walker had this arresting suggestion recently that so we were talking about what's the difference between technology, which can be this really fertile, inventive sort of pursuit. You're inventing things, you're making things. I mean, I love this stuff. That's what I do in my shop at home. So what's the difference between technology in that sense and technocracy? So technocracy is sort of a mode of social and economic organization. And I think the assembly line is the paradigmatic example of that. And what he suggested was technocracy means control without love. And I think in order to do the kind of abstracting from the particulars that you have to do in order to have the kind of big, view, a sort of systematic view from 30,000 feet, getting away from the particulars necessarily involves abstraction from the kind of thing that you could love, I want to say. So maybe there's just a kind of a tragic, inherent kind of divergence of what we love about technology, the creative, productive, what a craftsman does, and the spirit of technocracy insofar as it wants to sort of extend the logic of rational control into every domain without the kind of rich apprehension of and concern for particulars. And of course, where this really becomes evident is in the technocratic political regime that treats the human being as a kind of manipulable raw material. This is all, I'm getting way too abstract here, but I do think you put your finger on the key thing, which is love. And so I'm a recent convert to Christianity, and I've become cognizant of creation as, the world as given, as received, made out of love, and it's an astonishing thing. And I think the spirit of control can make it hard to experience the gratitude that is proper to a human being in light of what we're given. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.